it's interesting. Alex Karras kind of seemed to enjoy his time with Howard. I think Howard might have actually kind of liked Alex. He didn't have the distaste for him that Don Meredith did, because I think Don Meredith was able to get some good lines off on Howard. And a lot of times when I was watching the old shows, Alex would just be laughing along with Howard, never doing any needling of Howard. So it's a different perspective.
Welcome once again to the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs, and it's an honor to have a friend who I've known for about 17 years. Met him at the Game Show Congress, and he's the author of his 11th book that's coming out. It's called I'd Like to Buy a Vowell, Spinning 50 Years of Wheel of Fortune. Wesley Hyatt, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Josh. I appreciate it.
Well, tell us about your background and how you got into writing books about classic entertainment.
Wow. Let's see. I've now been doing it, oh my gosh, for over 25 years, and hard to believe. I got the idea originally when I had just finished a job working for years on weekly newspapers after I graduated from college, and I just kind of needed a break, and I thought the first thing I was thinking about was my first book was the Encyclopedia of Daytime Television, and as you and maybe some of the other listeners may know, that book came out of the fact that there was one for nighttime television that was printed several times by Tim Brooks and Earl Marsh on nighttime television. I kept on expecting, okay, they're going to do a daytime version, but they never did, and I said, okay, well then I'm interested enough and crazy enough to do it. I'm going to give it a shot. So I was like, well, how do I do it? So I learned how to come up with book proposals, queries as they're called, and I put some feelers out to some book companies that did not have require you to have an agent. And I got the proposal was accepted by Billboard Books. I was really excited about that. And it took me, at the time, this was right on the cusp before the Internet was really coming out and things. This was like 1994, 95. So it took me 2 years of researching, and I did a lot of, it's old enough VHS tapes, if people remember that, watching those, buying those and renting some of those, going through all the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature to find out what was written about them in magazines and what was written about them in the major newspapers, and just anywhere I could get any information that I needed. And somehow it all came together along with about 30 books that I use for reference for various types, and it went very well. And as I celebrated my first book, my publisher said, "Can't wait to see what your next idea is." And I was like, oh, I didn't know I was going to have a next idea. But that led me on to, as I had other jobs, led me on to do other books thereafter. And now, like it is, this one, I'd Like to Buy a Vowell, is now my 11th book in about 25 years. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the first book I remember you mentioning was the one about Monday Night Football. And that came out about 5 years after the TNT movie Monday Night Mayhem, where John Turturro played Howard Cosell, came out. And I enjoyed that movie, but I remember seeing some inaccuracies. One of them was the fact that they used, instead of the sport theme, they used the one that's been used pretty much since 1981 as the opening theme to the debut episode. Then also the NBC Executive Office was supposed to be there 1969 or 1970. Instead of having the snake logo for NBC, they have the 1979 peacock logo instead. So I'm wondering what else in that movie was inaccurate as far as what really happened, or are you not? How familiar are you with that movie, first of all, and what was accurate, what was inaccurate in that film?
I saw it. It was pretty accurate from what they had there, given the circumstance. They had to telescope a few events and so on there. But I do understand, as I understand from most reports, that there was the scene was pretty true when Keith Jackson confronted Roone Arledge about why he didn't get notified that he was being fired after the first season in favor of
Frank Gifford?
Who plays in that. Yes, Frank Gifford. Thank you.
That's okay.
Yeah, I remember Don Meredith. I remember Howard Cosell, but I didn't remember that. Yeah, it was. I thought it was a pretty good distillation of what they had going on at the time there. Some of it was kind of shortened and obscured for some things. They really didn't talk that much about the Alex Karras years, that much, because he was there 3 years, but it was not as big as a combination when they had Frank Meredith. And I was kind of amused how they were trying to do Howard Cosell's Saturday Night Variety show, and you could tell it was like done as thriftily as they could, I guess, because there was no shot of it. It was meant to imply it like it was a live big show, but it was really just John Turturro on stage with a curtain behind him doing stuff with the bright lights, and I'm like, they're trying to do as best they can with that. So, but overall, I thought it went really well for a story about that they had to tell. So yeah.
Yeah, I like the fact that John Turturro's mannerisms were spot on, not to mention the accuracy of the look of him. He had the slick back toupee in the early years of Monday Night Football, then the puffy toupee later on. Actually, the slick back toupee was much better and much more realistic looking than the horrible puffy one that Cosell eventually wore. He went from a good toupee to a really bad one.
Yeah, I wonder how many people, it's hard to describe Howard Cosell to younger generations like that. They'd be like, what? There was a guy who looked like that and sounded like that, and he was a major broadcaster. But, he was so good in having just the natural knack as a broadcaster, and he was able to do those halftime highlight reels, narrate them with no problem whatsoever, just one take,
Wow.
And yeah, he really was. Now, of course, Howard had his own problems too. Everyone can tell you about they had a run-in with Howard where it's like, his ego was showing up and everything. But at the same time, you got to realize when Howard came into broadcasting during the 50s, it was just expanding at the time, and there was some resentment on print reporters that he was getting access and having sometimes getting first interviews before they were able to do so with certain athletes, but he was one of a kind, definitely.
Yeah, and it was interesting because he was called the most loved and hated sportscaster. And when you wrote that book, how many people did you get to interview that knew Cosell personally?
I got to, Alex Karras was one of them that I interviewed, and a couple of others who worked backstage. That one I didn't have too many people that I was able to interview, but there was a fair amount, maybe 5 to 10 or so, I think, that were that had experience with Howard at the time there. And it's interesting. Alex Karras kind of seemed to enjoy his time with Howard. I think Howard might have actually kind of liked Alex. He didn't have the distaste for him that Don Meredith did, because I think Don Meredith was able to get some good lines off on Howard. And a lot of times when I was watching the old shows, Alex would just be laughing along with Howard, never, doing any needling of Howard. So, yeah, so it's a different perspective, definitely. So.
Oh, yeah. I confess the first time I heard of Alex Karras was the sitcom Webster, which he started with his real-life wife, Susan Harris. And I didn't even know they were a husband and wife in real life until probably about a year after the sitcom debuted, when they were doing a commercial together for, I think, Lazy Boy. My husband, Alex Karras, and he's like snoring on the couch, and all he says at the end is like, "That's cute, Susan." But hey, it worked for William Daniels and Bonnie Bartlett, who were on several shows together as husband and wife, or boyfriend and girlfriend. So so why not?
Both of those couples had some of the longest marriages in Hollywood. Good for them.
Yeah, I think they've been married for about 70 years now.
Incredible. Yeah.
And Bob Newhart and his wife Jenny were married for 60 years until her passing last year. So, we oftentimes don't hear about those. We only hear about the marriages that don't work.
Yeah, I think was it Bob or someone there? I think he said, like, when it comes to comedians, it's like they either have long marriages or their personal lives are screwed up, in terms of love. And it does make sense because, he and his wife and Don Rickles and his wife were longtime pals and, forever together. But then you have someone like, Richard Pryor, who had several, failed marriages and things, and just go on that way. It's an interesting dynamic to say the least.
Oh yeah, another marriage that was a long time was Bob and Dolores Hope, and you wrote a book called Bob Hope on TV. How many people did you get to interview for that particular book?
That one, I'm trying to think. I had about 20 to 25 people. I had some of his writers who survived, who were there with him. A few people who did guest shots on the show with him as well. Different ones that way. And I was trying to get a hold of some people with his family, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't exceed it at a time. And I think there might have been one or two people, production-wise, I think I might have gotten as well, too. Bob was just a man who was constantly in demand, constantly on TV. Even when I tried to cover as much as I could, but I'm sure I missed several appearances that he did on television because he was just on it all the time. He really had an affinity for the medium, even though I think he would say he kind of preferred doing radio, because radio, you could look at the script and not have to worry about, as on TV, when he was obviously on TV, he had to use cue cards a lot. And you could see that whenever he was doing it. You notice sometimes he'd be looking off the side, and you could obviously tell he was reading off of something there. But that was a style that worked for him, and, it lasted for forever. No other comedian has had a run of starring on hit specials like Bob has had, and I don't think another one will.
No, in fact, I remember first seeing him on the California Federal Savings Bank commercials here in Southern California from the late 70s to mid 80s. Yeah. And I didn't realize, it's kind of weird. My first introductions to these famous people. That's the guy that's speaking for the bank. Just like John Houseman, Smith Barney was the first introduction I remember him doing. Yeah. But I remember Bob Hope had an open invitation to the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. That anytime he wanted to come on stage, I've been hearing that was kind of like pre-planned. It wasn't just suddenly like a sudden walk on to the show. Can you verify that?
Yeah, well, with Bob being the superstar that he was kind of given carte blanche to show up on the series whenever he wanted or needed to promote something, and that was a lot of times for him. And as a result, he was also he was living in Toluca Lake, which is near where Burbank is located at there, and Burbank was where they were doing the Tonight Show during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So with that in mind, he was able to get on there pretty much any time he wanted. He got a routine down where he was actually had his makeup guy come to his house, so he just kind of was able to just stroll in, and then do a little bit with Johnny, and then kind of leave if he wanted to leave early, and I think that Johnny got a little bit kind of irritated with that sometime. He thought, Bob was maybe a little too cavalier and thought that the show was just being his promotional thing. But at the same time, Bob had such a big reputation, and Bob would get a lot of good jokes off on the show, too. So that would get that to their advantage as well. And in his later years, as I noted there, it became more difficult. Johnny would have to speak kind of loud and kind of stick to a script because Bob was starting to, lose focus and everything. And if you didn't give him the right setups, he might be confused on what to say back. That was kind of a shame that way. But overall, looking back, I mean, most of the time, Bob's guest spots on Carson shows during the 60s through the 80s are really good. It's just in the 90s when things went down health-wise with them that it became a little bit dicey on the show.
Now, with Bob also appearing back in the 1960s, unfortunately, most of those episodes of Tonight with Johnny Carson are gone. Mm-hmm. Did Bob save every single episode of Tonight that he was on? Because I know that sometimes a celebrity will do that for their own collection.
He it's a film archivist, and I didn't talk to the guy about that. I don't think he did. I think Bob was mainly concerned about making sure that he had all of his shows recorded there because I think he learned during the 50s that maybe a little late that some of his shows were not kept in good quality, and the kinescopes were just what they do were just basically filming off of a TV tube, to get a copy of the show that's not as high quality as what you want. So several of his shows from the 50s have been lost, but from about 55 onward, he had a good person to take care of it. But I don't think he necessarily wanted to have every appearance he had on TV because he was just like, I saw something in the TV book of lists that Bob appeared, over 100 times on Mike Douglas, Merv Griffin, Dinah Shore, and the Tonight Show, mm-hmm. all within like a 2.5 year period. And,
wow.
If that's just a thing, you can imagine what it's other like. And then you go with that, and he would come by. He'd do local TV stations too if he was in the area. Anything to promote it. So, he had been tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of time on the air.
Yeah, it makes me think now, wondering about the Mike Douglas show, the Merv Griffin show, Dinah, and Dinah's Place before that.
Mm-hmm.
What are the chances, as a TV historian? What kind of chances are there of us ever seeing those shows again, like on Roku or Vudu or Hulu?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've learned never to say never because there's some shows I thought we'd never see, and they've actually been able to come out somehow that way. The thing with the shows themselves, a lot of them would, if they came back, they'd have to be edited some because of the music rights. That's the big sticking thing. Costs a lot of money and prevent them going there. So when they have some highlights of the Carson show, you just see or hear him introduce a person, and the next thing you see is the person coming out of the curtain on it. You're like, what happened there? And it's because they had to cut out the music from the band,
Oh, yeah.
Now, as to who owns what, I know there are a couple of different people owning the rights to those shows, and I don't know to what extent the tapes themselves are in good quality and how they can get together. You would think that them being, the talk shows being videotaped, they should be okay, but there could be some, degradation depending on how well the tapes are stored. And that's been the big issue, that we have that. And I don't know offhand where all of them are being stored. I would think, if Merv had wanted, maybe he would have done something and, donated it to a museum or to a reference library like UCLA, something like that. But I don't think that's the case. I know Steve Allen did that with a lot of his material there for UCLA, but I don't think Merv did necessarily, and which would be a surprise because I know Merv was really upset with the way CBS. When he was on CBS from 69 and 72, virtually all those shows were lost because the network taped over them, to save money. So, yeah.
And next time we'll share some more stories about Steve Allen. This is the Talking Archive. We are in conversation with Wesley Hyatt, author of 11 books, including his brand new one, I'd Like to Buy a Vowell, Spinning 50 Years of Wheel of Fortune. We will also find out some great stories about the Wheel of Fortune pilot.